Hello and welcome to Neurodiversity at 2:15. This is a weekly show throughout September at the moment on Wednesdays at 2:15 in the afternoon. That's London time, Dublin time, where Owen Stevens and myself, Fauna Beauvais, are chatting about neurodiversity over the coming weeks. And we've sent invites out to other counsellors and psychotherapists to join us if they'd like to. So if you do comment, if you do talk about anything, if you refer to any of your work, please refrain from referring specifically to any client. It's okay to talk in general terms about client work if done in an anonymous way. And so now I'm going to hand over to Owen, and we're going to let you know who we are.
Thanks, Fauna. So I'm Owen Stevens, and I'm a therapist and counsellor near Dublin in Ireland, and also a trainer. I've done a lot of training over the years as well. So that's what myself and Ivana are working on together, is working on providing more training in this area. And I'm autistic myself. I've known that for over 10 years now, but I was still fairly late in life by the time I discovered. I'm 10 years later now, but it was late enough. And so that's part of the theme that we'll be talking about today, is late discovery, that phenomenon of nowadays where lots of people are discovering they're autistic relatively late in life and well into adulthood.
Yeah, thanks, Owen. So I'm Fauna Beauvais, and I'm also a late identified autistic person. So I'm a psychotherapist, counsellor, and I do coaching for ADHDers as well. And we're both trainers at Vanguard Neurodiversity Training, which offers training in neurodiversity, of course, for healthcare professionals. And yeah, as Owen was saying, today we are focusing on that, because it's interesting, isn't it, how people who have not known that they were autistic when they were children, but would have been autistic when they were children, are recognizing this later in life. So it throws up loads of questions, doesn't it, Owen, really?
Well, I was thinking about it as we were kind of doing our lead in there, and, it's something that we're experiencing for ourselves, have experienced for ourselves, and are still experiencing the unpacking of that discovery, and that we're experiencing huge amount with clients that come to us nowadays. Top reason in the work we now do in our practices, top reason that somebody contacts us is simply the fact that they have discovered that they are autistic and they're looking for someone to talk to about that. But I was thinking that the statistics obviously are going to shift around a bit for a while yet. But the rough but seemingly probably fairly accurate figure nowadays that's suggested is that probably about 2% of the population are autistic. 2% of the population, as in the world population. Now, there has to be more research around the world to really firm up that figure, but it seems to be approximately right, according to the research, which means 1 in 50 people of any age, gender, or any other demographic are autistic, meet the criteria for being autistic. How many of those people know they're autistic? Tiny fraction, again, at any age. But if we stick with the adult piece at the moment, it means that there are potential discoveries out there in the billions, well, maybe not quite, but in the hundreds of millions to happen. Now they won't all happen, and they don't all have to happen. Not everybody who's autistic will or has to discover they're autistic. But there's a domino effect out there at the moment as more adults discover they're autistic, and the message then goes out from them to their nearest and dearest, and that's another piece we'll talk about. There's a massive domino effect happening at the moment, and it's exciting. It's very interesting from our professional point of view, and it does seem to be becoming a big healthcare and psychological services issue and political issue in both in the UK and in Ireland.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and actually, I was reading this morning that the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which is the National Public Health Agency of the USA, they've got as their official statistic that 1 in 44 people are autistic. But interestingly, official figures in Northern Ireland are 1 in 22.
Oh.
I know. I need to fact fact check that, but I got it from a reliable source, so I will do, and I'll put it in the link below the video.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah, and as I said, I think these statistics will jump around a little bit and settle as the years go by, but it's in that region, which means, again, we're not talking about 1 in a million people. We're talking about a significant minority of people that are autistic. And despite various questions and suggestions, the research also seems to be fairly strongly these days on the side of the notion that there's no particular reason to think that prevalence has increased. I mean, that suggestion has been made, but the evidence isn't good, and the evidence is stronger at the moment for the idea that the prevalence has probably been pretty much the same as far back as we can trace, at least, which means that therefore there's not just 1 in 40 or 50 children that are autistic, but there is 1 in 40 or 50 adults. And that's interesting from that kind of statistical large scale point of view. But of course, the bit that is an issue for us every day in our work, as well as in our experience, is at the very individual level. It's those individuals who are saying, I've just realized, or I've just been diagnosed, I've got an assessment of being diagnosed, I'm 55, or I'm 27, or I'm 63, or whatever, and I've discovered I'm autistic, or I've been reading about it and I really, really think I quite likely am. Can I talk to you about it? So that piece is just a huge amount of our work these days. And to be able to do that, I mean, it's a piece that we'll be including a good bit on in our training, to be able to contain that and help people through that process of wondering, of discovery, of identification, and possibly of formal diagnosis that they wanted. And then all the implications of that. What does that mean for my history, for my future, for my identity, for my family, for my job, for a million things? It's an extraordinary process.
Yeah, who am I? Who was I before? What did other people think who I was? And has that affected how my life's gone?
Yeah.
And often it had.
Yeah. And I do think in some ways that's one of the biggest pieces of work. Just doing that piece of work earlier with somebody today, just how do you maybe reinterpret your past in the light of that? Things that you found difficult and you couldn't figure out why you found them difficult. Equally, things came easy to you, but you weren't clear why. Now, maybe you worried less about that, but still, it was a bit of a puzzle, all sorts of relational glitches and difficulties and puzzles and mismatches that didn't seem to make any sense, that can be made sense of in retrospect, and very much can be a big part of the explanation for mental health problems. So quite a lot of people are quite puzzled, thinking, well, I don't think I was obviously traumatized. Now, some people have also clear traumas that they can look at in their past, but some people are saying, I don't certainly see anything very obvious there. I did find adolescence very difficult, but I don't quite know why, but I did. And so that was kind of traumatizing for me. But why did I even find it difficult? And the answers can often lie in autism and other forms of neurodivergence.
Yeah. And when you start looking at things through that lens, you can get different insights, can't you? Because, and you often find as well that clients may have been in crisis at various points in their life, and they might have tried to speak out about it, but they've perhaps been closed down by themselves or other people, saying, oh, you're being over dramatic, or you're difficult, or, well, everyone goes through this or that or the other, or that they've actually approached healthcare professionals, and that those professionals have sort of, in a sense, in effect, have been a barrier to diagnosis, to that, or to be being put forward for an assessment, because they've not recognised those things as being autistic, that autistic traits or relevant to one's cognitive style, and they've said, well, it's depression or anxiety or worse personality disorders, or all kinds of things that you were talking about before.
Yeah, like, for instance, intensity of thinking and high levels of analyzing and planning can be a, you know, a secondary problem. They can be a symptom of anxiety, for instance, like anxious people do a lot of those things, but they can also be a fundamental cognitive style. They can, to be even more complicated, they can be a fundamental cognitive style that again gets hijacked by anxiety, which is what I meet with a lot of autistic clients. In other words, they have a basic brain that works that way. It thinks in a lot of detail, and that's not necessarily a problem. It's just good for some things and not good for other things. They then develop a lot of anxiety because they feel very different from other people, and sometimes because they're bullied and so on and so forth, and plenty of ways that story can go. And then unfortunately the anxiety hijacks that very detailed style of thinking, very thorough style of thinking. I sometimes say to clients, there's nobody better for thinking anxiously than an autistic person, because they can do it in such beautiful detail. On the other hand, the good news is there's nobody better for, if you can change your thinking in a more helpful direction, you can do that also very intensively and very thoroughly, you know. But I do think in our field, we didn't know enough to make that distinction, and therefore often it was all attributed to anxiety, and an attempt then to shift that intense type of thinking to heal it in a way, whereas that bit doesn't need healing for an autistic person.
No, because if our brains work in a systematic way to solve problems and to make meaning, then why stop that if that's a fundamental cognitive style? And saying stop overthinking it isn't helpful. It's like, well, let's carry on thinking about it, but we'll do it in a systematic way.
And in a helpful way, whatever that turns out to be. Yeah, a useful way, a way that will lead us to somewhere better. And one of those ways of thinking is, of course, put it this way, you could use other language for it, I suppose, but autism positive, you know, neuro affirming. It's let's begin to think about your cognitive style and your relational preferences and your sensory sensitivity. Let's try and reframe all of that as simply who you are, and start getting to value it and make some good use of it. I mean, that's pretty much a fundamental bottom line description of what we do, isn't it?
Yeah, and of course, being neuro-affirming as well is having the client lead the agenda. You know, so it's what is important to that client. It's not for the therapist to dismiss something as being anxiety. You know, so therefore that issue isn't important.
I mean, I think one of the things that, from a practical point of view, that I have found is very important is client-led, but quite a lot of guided discovery and education and suggestions by the therapist. People sometimes need to be given permission to think that something might be a possibility, that deep down they maybe have thought it's a possibility, because in their life it's been invalidated and they've told it's not a possibility. So you know, I certainly gently will be saying to clients, well, perhaps you have sometimes wondered whether your way of thinking was unusual and yet maybe of value, but you were told it wasn't. You were told, no, do it a different way. That's, for instance, hyper focus for hours on one topic or on one subject or on one interest. You know, you were told was weird. So you thought, well, it must be, but has maybe part of you sometimes thought, but maybe it isn't, you know? And it opens up then for the client to lead and say, well, yes, this is actually what it really feels like for me. Because I think, you know, autistic people, I mean, it's not that the people around them know they're autistic. How much difference that would make is another question. But autistic people are told you're wrong a lot of the time. You couldn't be feeling so much sensory sensitivity. The lights are fine for everyone else, so what's wrong with you, you know?
Or as well, the other thing is having with scattered profile or spiky profile, you're doing all right in that area, so you can't be struggling in this or the other area. It can't be as painful as you're saying. That's
an interesting example, because I just used the term spiky profile with the client today, and again, you could see the light bulb going on. They're thinking, oh, that's a name for something that I know very well from my youth, but nobody ever put those words on it. And if they had, it would have been really helpful. So in retrospect, they're thinking, yeah, that's it. Yes, that's what I experienced, spiky profile. Because again, they were just brilliant at some things in school, terrible at other things, and brilliant at certain forms of learning, and then terrible at others. And again, nobody could make sense of it.
It's like, it doesn't make sense that I can do a huge report and then present it to the board, but yet I can't make that one phone call. It seems, the two things don't seem aligned.
Yeah. And, people don't even have to be directly told that shouldn't be a problem for you. Alison just put something in the chat there, which is that other sensory items I've come across include auditory or nasal stimulation. For example, the stress of hold music on a phone call. Yeah. And like people will simply, notice that nobody else complains about it.
Yeah.
And then they will think, well, shouldn't be a problem for me, They won't even go so far as saying, oh, I hate this, and other people saying, what's wrong with you? They'll just think, well, nobody else is making a fuss, so I shouldn't find it difficult,
And so when you then realise and recognise about being an autistic person, what changes around that then? Because now there's the invitation, isn't there? There's the permission to not have to say that this shouldn't be bothering me. It could be a different question that you ask in yourself. I wonder why this is bothering me, and what ways can I get my needs met around this?
Yeah, and what can I do? Yeah, how could I change my own behavior or environment, or advocate for myself, or something, or just say, well, I don't want to put up with this. And I think all those questions of the implications and the value of the discovery are what the thing we want to go into, including how that ties in with the notion of that the person has been masking, whatever that means, and needs to unmask. But we'll come back to that. In fact, I think we'll come back to some more of that next time. One of the bits we were talking about earlier that we said we'd give a little bit of time to today is that almost before you get to that point of kind of unpacking and reinterpreting, a lot of people and a lot of the clients that we work with do find themselves initially caught in a couple of other things. One of them is, well, who do I tell about this, and what are they going to think of it? And we might come back to that one in a minute. But the other one is, this seems very clear now, after a few sessions, or even after a full assessment and diagnosis. No, it's very, and after some reading and after listening to people on podcasts or whatever, I'm definitely autistic. I've always been autistic. Couldn't be clearer. But then, how come it wasn't clear until now, until age 55? People really need to chew away at that one a bit. And it's an interesting one, and I think we can help with it, because there are very, if you like, good reasons, reasons that make sense, why it wasn't apparent before, why nobody was aware of it. I mean, the biggest one of all is just, this stuff just wasn't being much talked about, I mean, really, the last few years have been extraordinary. I mean, literally the last 3, 4, 5 have been extraordinary. Say nothing of the last 10 or 15, but the amount of shift in sort of people talking about this area of neurodiversity, neurodivergence, autism, ADHD, like
in real people,
just, in real people that we know, that are kind of like us, that's extraordinary. So like, why would, I mean, if I take my own example, like, why would I have known any sooner than 10 years ago? And to be honest, I only knew 10 years ago because it came more to my attention in my practice. If I was just, if you like, not in the profession, then I would be more finding it out now or a few years ago, because there's only enough normalization and information going around to lead people to discover it. And the information is getting more accurate, because again, the information used to be, well, if you're like Rain Man, you're autistic. Other than that, you're not. That's a slight exaggeration, but it's not that much. So that's what, it's a huge shift, that, isn't it?
It is, yeah. I mean, I can remember in 2009 and 2010, looking on the internet, there was nothing. There weren't the lovely chorus of autistic voices that broadcast themselves as they do now. There was nothing like that, you see, because I don't think really social media, people weren't really broadcasting anyway. But apart from that, people weren't knowing. There was a few sparse papers or websites, that would be talking about it in a very medicalized way. Nothing where I could relate to any of that, or nothing where I could hear it in like real life language, if you like.
Yeah, the relevant language. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Where that leads people to think, that's like me. That's another part of the answers to the question why people don't find out, don't realize they're autistic. A lot of people just find a life that suits them, and fair play to them. They find a partner, a job, friends, a niche that suits them, and life becomes a bit less of a struggle, and they just get on with things. And so why would they be looking for an explanation for anything? I mean, they find social occasions difficult, but they largely just avoid them. So they're seen as shy or whatever. And that leads us into the other piece, which is all the alternative explanations. I'm socially anxious, I have an eating disorder, I've borderline personality disorder, I must be just a bit of a psychopath. All the official and unofficial alternative explanations that people give themselves and get from
given,
the diagnosis.
Or they're a loner, or they're awkward, or they're
eccentric,
or difficult, or dramatic. And of course there's a massive topic which we will definitely talk about, because it deserves its own big conversation, really. But the thing about why people might not have known or said or thought about being autistic is because there's that thing about what they themselves may have thought that autism is. There's the internalized stigma, the representations of autism. A client said to me the other day, it's difficult to be thinking of, like, can I align myself with a disabled identity? It is a question, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And, that is a mixture between the sort of what we've all internalized growing up in terms of the connotations, stigma of a term like autistic. And then there's also, no matter how much or little, internalized autophobia that people might have or not have. There's simply a fear of what other people will think. So it's not an easy, even the discovery itself is not like an unmixed blessing when it comes to how people feel. They might think, well, that's pretty clear and I'm glad to have it clear, but also a lot of relief and grief, they often say, is a combination. But I think what needs to be added to that also is a lot of potential, if not shame, then at least fear of how other people will see it if they tell them.
And not all irrational either,
No, some of that is justified. Yeah.
And we've got to be realistic and help clients to take care of themselves, and say, well, let's be realistic about this. Let's sort the wheat from the chaff. Which are the bits where there's internalized stigma around it, and which is like there are some real risks and some real vulnerabilities, because we don't know what everybody thinks autism is or how to treat autistic people.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it is maybe a piece for us to unpack a bit more next time, would be, the experience people have of coming out, if you want to use that, borrow that term. But then what goes with that, the unmasking process of being a bit more of who you are and beginning to uncensor some of the aspects of yourself that you realize you've censored, or, stop bothering doing some of the things that deep down is not you and you really hate doing, and how people around you feel about that. So the impact on relationships is potentially wonderful, but potentially complex, and sometimes can have negative aspects.
Do you mean the ways in which a person may have, in a relational sense, acted like everyone expects, or an appropriate version of themselves?
Well, a version that brings them less criticism and less invalidation, and when they start shifting into a little bit more of who they really are, not everybody likes it, because it doesn't suit everybody around them quite so well.
That's the whole thing, isn't it?
They might stop just always agreeing to things, and start saying, no, actually, I'm happy to do that, but I'm not happy to do that. You all go off and do it, but I'm not interested, so I'm not going to,
Yeah, I mean, that comes up a lot, doesn't it, in therapy sessions, and I think as therapists, we can help clients to work through and think through what's right for them as an individual person with their relationships and in their context, about how they might go about that.
Rachel says, for me, a big learning curve is finding the language to express these things. It's huge. I would agree with that. I think personally and professionally, as an autistic person, I think this experience with my autistic clients, but then as a therapist trying to help them as well, language is a hugely important piece of the process and the puzzle, isn't it? Putting names on things and just finding words to express. I think, for instance, this is part of why we have these conversations, both on our own and sometimes publicly. It's because we're trying always to find the language, the better and better language to talk about these experiences.
Yeah, and language is a really big thing, isn't it? Because there's the language that we might use or might be trying to select to use, and then there's the language that is used about us as well.
Yeah, and that's had a longer run.
Yeah,
It's used about us. It's more established, and it's more literature on it. It's fast. The balance is fast shifting, I think. Yeah. But,
and it ties into why some people have not identified or not known about being autistic because of the language around it.
Well, that's really interesting note to finish on, maybe, because it's one of these concepts that I came across in the last few years. It comes from other places, but it's very relevant to the autistic and neurodivergent experience, and that's the concept of epistemic injustice. How knowledge can just belong to some groups and not others, and how certain groups have the right to define what the true knowledge is, and how other people's, often the people who are most affected, their experience and their verbalizing of it and their knowledge of it is dismissed in some way. So it's a scary subject when you open it up, but it is the reality. Yeah. So
language does have the ability, or can be used, to injure or empower.
And invalidate, but also to validate. Then if it's used in the right way. So we're looks like we're on the time. So will we leave it there for today?
Yes, thank you very much.
Thanks everybody, and thanks for listening and for your comments.
Thank you for the comments. Nice to.
If you want to be part of the sequel, and we'll talk about. It looks like we know what we're talking about next time, because I think it's a natural follow on. Is just continue this piece about, well, what's the opening up, both in the sense of coming out and the opening up in the sense of unmasking yourself. We'll talk more about that next week. Yeah.
And if you didn't find us on LinkedIn, if you got us from somewhere else, if you got the link from somewhere else, do feel free to connect with us on LinkedIn.
Great. Yeah, that'd be good. Okay. All right. Thanks, everybody. So hopefully see you again.
Thank you.
All the best. Bye-bye.
Bye.